Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar called Predictive and Flexible Scheduling, What, When, Where, and Why. I'm Debbie House, Editor-in-Chief of Retail TouchPoints, and I'll be moderating today's presentation. We're honored to be joined today by three executives, Molly Lombardi from Aptitude Research Partners, Dr. Nathan Woods from Edgeworth Economics, and Bruce Steen from McGuire Woods, who will be delving into predictive and flexible retail scheduling. Today's presentation, we're using the On24 platform. Right now, you should be viewing the On24 dashboard, which shows the live viewing screen. By clicking on the Questions widget on the right-hand side of the screen, you can type in questions during the live presentation and press Submit. You'll also find a widget named Resources under Questions. There, you can download assets our presenters have provided. All you have to do is click on the resource and it'll automatically download. We also welcome you to follow this session on Twitter using the predictive scheduling hashtag. And here you can also see the Twitter handles for speakers and their companies. For those of you who might be new to Retail Touchpoints, here's a quick overview. We're an all-digital media company publishing 3 weekly email and online newsletters, daily news, special reports, and multimedia presentations. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our weekly newsletter. And we welcome input and feedback through traditional means, phone and email, and also social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Our website is retailtouchpoints.com. Before I introduce today's speakers, I want to remind our audience that the presentation is slated for approximately 30 minutes with time for live questions at the end. We invite our audience to submit questions in the On24 questions area as they come to mind. Our presenters have agreed to stay online following the presentation to respond to your questions. So today we'll hear from Molly Lombardi, co-founder and CEO of Aptitude Research Partners. She has written and spoken around the world on issues such as leadership development, employee engagement, workforce management, payroll, and workplace culture. Aptitude Research Partners, an HCM-focused research, analyst, and advisory firm, conducts primary research covering end-to-end human capital management to understand the impact of HR strategies and technologies on organizational outcomes and individual success. We'll also hear from Dr. Nathan D. Woods from Edgeworth Economics. Dr. Woods is an expert with a wide variety of experience with analytical topics relating to labor and employment matters. He analyzes data and testifies on class action topics involving commonality, typicality, allegations of work off the clock, non-payment of overtime, and meal break violations. Outside of litigations, Dr. Woods regularly consults with Fortune 500 clients, including the retail, restaurant, and grocery industries, on a variety of labor and employment and other analytical questions. Our third speaker today is Bruce M. Steen from McGuire Woods. Bruce is the chair of the firm's labor and employment practice. He represents employers and management in labor and employment matters. He has extensive experience litigating collective and class action claims throughout the United States arising under federal and state wage and hour and wage payment statutes, including the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act. This work includes serving as National Wage and Hour Class and Collective Action Counsel for a large financial institution. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Molly. Welcome to you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I'm really happy to be here. And thanks so much for the kind introduction. I always cringe a little bit whenever people read my bio because basically what it boils down to is I'm a data geek and a storyteller. So hopefully today I'll be able to share with you some data around predictive and flexible scheduling and sort of how it can impact your business before we get into the discussion with our other two experts here today. And so we're going to talk a little bit about, what predictive and flexible scheduling means. How do you balance those two seemingly potentially opposite kind of ideas? And we're going to talk about how you can put them to use for your business today. So like a researcher, we think about when you write something or want to understand something, go back to those 5 W's. We already know who. It's you all that are here on the call with us today who are in the retail space and who are facing some of these challenges around scheduling and predictive scheduling. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's driving this need for change, when we need to respond, where to look for help, and why it really matters to your business. So obviously the retail industry has a lot of things going on with it today and a lot of changes happening. And this is actually a list of top retail trends from NRF. And when you look at these trends, buying online and picking up in the store, it's sort of a different, not a transactional relationship, but more of a service relationship. They're looking for retail associates to be able to talk about technology. There's sort of this showrooming experience that's happening in experiential retail where people want to come and experience the products, maybe not to buy then, but they want to have an experience. They want to be able to touch and feel and make some decisions, but then eventually order somewhere else. And online food service, which I thought was interesting, but the one thing it did raise in my mind was the idea of compliance needs that might be happening and changing in the retail space. So we've got all these new things that are happening in the retail industry that are causing us to think differently about the type of staff that we have, and also how do we balance the need to be as efficient as possible, given the razor-thin margins, and be able to deliver these experiences for employees and customers. At the same time, your customers and your employees are changing in terms of the consumerization of technology and how that's impacting their lives and their expectations. This is from a list from Forbes of the top trends in consumerization from a technology perspective. We've got AI everywhere. We've got AI assistants in our home that we're talking to. People are sort of expecting to be able to exchange information in that way. Digital centralization. People want anything everywhere. They want to be able to have access to their information. 5G preparation. That's all about speed, being able to access things quickly and effectively. Data overload. All this information that we can get because we can get anything everywhere. How do you sort out what's important? The seamless ongoing conversation with your technology. It's not, again, transactional. It's more of a relationship. And again, the user experience, which from a technology perspective is important, but also from a sort of retail experience. So when you think about these trends coming together, it really is a very different environment. But then you layer on top of the fact that the labor environment is changing too. From the study that we did late last year about the most desired solution capabilities when it came to workforce management solutions and things like scheduling optimization, making sure that you get those effective combinations of shifts or days, again, because wanting to make sure that you're as efficient and cost efficient as possible. Things like real-time alerts that help you understand when people go into overtime or beyond desired hours or into other violations of compliance rules. Mobile access for information for management tasks and employees, and then also shift swapping. So this, again, this sort of dichotomy between compliance and efficiency, but also the flexibility that the managers and employees are looking for. So it's a real challenge that organizations are facing. So what it comes down to is retail is changing, workers are changing, and the technology you are using has to change as well. Now the good news is being able to see that with automated solutions, things like engagement, turnover, customer retention are vastly improved. But of course, it's not just the technology that does all this. It's really important to make sure that you have technology to be efficient, but you also have to think about the policies and how you're actually bringing these things to life and how you're bringing your scheduling processes to life through the technology as well. Because again, we see the impact of automation and sort of the efficiency angle, but then we also see things like shift swapping, being able to let people have some control over their schedules and how that ties into engagement and turnover. So companies are having to really balance this, this tension between compliance and efficiency and giving people flexibility. And so when we try to dissect, what is it about a schedule that makes it predictable but also flexible? So when we talked about the different types of predictability, we came up with sort of 3 categories that we're going to talk a little bit about. Do they follow a consistent pattern? Do I mostly work on Tuesdays? Do I always work on Saturdays? Do I never work the 3rd week of the month? This predictability, having some sort of rhythm and pattern that people can follow. The second kind of consistency is around changes. And this is particularly to management, adding or dropping shifts after a schedule is posted. There's nothing worse than expecting you're going to have a certain paycheck one week, and then all of a sudden, someone cancels a shift, and so you have to readjust what your expectations are. Or sometimes people getting called in for too many shifts. So this sort of being able to rely on the stability of the schedule is important. And then availability. You know when you're going to know. You can trust that 2 weeks in advance or 3 weeks in advance or 10 days in advance, whatever the amount is, you have this trust that the schedule is going to be available. So we looked at organizations that have to think about all these different types of consistency, because it's really important for people to be able to count on the organization's consistency, but then also be able to let the organization use tools to let people be flexible. Because again, people's lives change from day to day, and so being able to use these rules to make the sort of official schedule, but then also be able to provide that flexibility is really key. because balance is for everyone. Every one of your employees has different thoughts. For some of them, predictability is that I know I can always pick up extra shifts or things like that. So it's, again, how do you manage this? Being able to have people that are qualified for a certain shift that aren't going to violate overtime rules or other compliance rules, but still give them that flexibility. And again, automating these solutions really helps drive higher quality. When we have automated scheduling, we sort of have a higher level of consistency, and we also have a higher level of flexibility. So organizations that have higher levels of engagement, which is so important for that evolving retail environment, the experiential retail environment, the conversational, being able to educate people about products even if they're not making the sale at the time, is so important, and we're seeing this flexibility being able to drive that as well. And so it's a combination of rules and tools. How do you make sure you have the right rules to keep your schedules consistent in the ways that are important in terms of being available, being reliable, but then also be able to flex within that constraint. And what it really comes down to when we talk about the technology drivers that people are looking for, it's about overall compliance, making sure that you're doing everything right. You're also being fair, and you're improving scheduling, which is a tall order for a schedule to be delivering. But it's really important to think about this as the proactive side of managing your labor costs, the proactive side of managing the risk around non-compliance, the proactive side of managing things like absence and call-outs. And so really being able to think about how your technology can help you proactively manage all of these key issues. It's, again, important to remember, technology only takes you so far. Someone said something the other day that really stuck with me, and they said, a robot is your dumbest employee because it does exactly what you tell it to do. And it's the same with any tools. Tools we use to help us optimize scheduling really only do exactly what we tell them to do. So we need to make sure we understand what the intent of our tools and technology are. We want to ensure compliance, but again, these things like fairness and performance are important as well. So we're going to talk, I know, a lot about compliance in our roundtable, but when it comes to compliance that people are looking for, again, this ability to manage things like healthcare regulations, leave, multi-jurisdictional wage and hour regulations, there's so much complexity when it comes to the right person, right place, right time, at the right pay rate, at the right compliance regulations, making sure you're managing all of that, again, proactively, not reacting to it after something has gone wrong, but really being able to use scheduling to proactively manage the fairness, the compliance, and all the other aspects to deliver a great experience to keep the loyalty of your customers and the loyalty of your employees. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Debbie. I know she's going to lead us in our conversation and talking a little bit more about some of these compliance and rules that organizations are looking to these solutions to help them integrate into their scheduling processes.
Thank you so much, Molly, for that high-level overview. Now we're going to invite Bruce and Nathan to join us for a roundtable discussion. And I'm going to jump in with the first question right now. Bruce, can you answer this question for us? How many states and localities have enacted some version of fair or predictive scheduling laws or ordinances?
It's a great question, and the answer changes almost monthly. This concept for just to give you a little context, hasn't been around all that long. The first real significant foray into this area of lawmaking was in November of 2014 when San Francisco enacted what's called the Formula Retail Rights Ordinance. And since then, one state, Oregon, and many localities, including Seattle, Washington, New York City, San Jose, California, Emeryville, California, and many others have adopted some version of what we call predictive scheduling laws, which is carry a wide range of different elements. But in addition to that, there are about 15 other states around the country, and when I say around the country, I mean all over the country, who are either considering such legislation or there is legislation already deep into the legislative process. We have laws being introduced in Illinois, Indiana, state of Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota. So this is not, and even in a couple in the Deep South, so this is not necessarily a coastal phenomenon that a lot of employment laws tend to be. This is kind of a nationwide trend, and that number, I suspect, will go up, not go down.
Okay, great. Yes, so retailers really need to take this seriously. The next question is, to what types of employers do these laws apply?
Well, that varies, as you might expect, with all of the different locations, states, and local governments that are dealing with these issues. You might expect some variation, but there are a couple of themes. One, in general, they apply to what we call formula retail establishments, such as retail stores, fast food establishments, restaurants, hotels, cleaning services. The theme really to focus on is that the laws are designed to apply to relatively good-sized employers which have national or multi-jurisdictional operations, but which also have a significant nexus to the jurisdiction. So think of a city, for example, like San Jose, California. It's going to apply to large restaurant chains or food establishments whose names you'd recognize, who have national footprints but also have a significant presence in that jurisdiction. And most of that is a legislative compromise in recognition that the larger employers have the financial and the economic capacity to absorb some of these limitations that maybe a smaller employer wouldn't have. But having said that, in some of the more recent proposals, some of the locations that are pursuing these kinds of laws have extended them to all covered employers who are considered non-exempt under the wage and hour laws. So it goes beyond the kind of the traditional retail establishments.
Okay, all right. Now, as a follow-up, what do these myriad state and local laws and ordinances require?
Well, this is the question that presents the most difficulty for employers who are operating in multiple jurisdictions, because there are about 7, 8, 9, 10 different attributes that fall under the umbrella of predictive scheduling, and not every statute or local ordinance includes every one. I can give you some examples. The typical ordinance or law, which we would call a predictive scheduling piece of legislation, would include some of the following requirements. Advance notice of shifts and work schedules that are required. So they will require the employer to give its employees some advance notice. Sometimes it's 14 days, sometimes it's longer, sometimes it's shorter, but 14 days seems to be kind of the norm of the shifts that they're going to be asked to work. Some even require a pre-employment estimate of the schedules and the minimum number of hours that the employee will be asked to work, so the employee can make an informed decision about whether they want to take the job. There's a provision called predictable pay, and which is really designed to combat last-minute schedule changes. So, for example, it might require an employer to pay an employee a certain number of hours when the employer all of a sudden makes a last-minute change to the schedule. One of the things that we hear in the legislative history of these discussions are the frustration with employees who will show up for a shift and all of a sudden their employer says, "Oh, I don't need you today, go home," which the social scientists can tell you better than I can, which is very disruptive to an hourly employee's ability to get an education, because they can't predict class schedules, to work multiple jobs, which some of them have to do to make ends meet. And so that's designed to prevent that, or at least ameliorate it. Another popular element is on-call pay, where the employees are entitled to a certain number of hours of pay when they're required to be on call, to be called in at the last minute, for example. One of the things the concepts that kind of drove some of these early laws, particularly on the West Coast, was this concept of clopening, which is a shift that, for example, somebody closes down a fast food establishment, they go home at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they have to be back at 7 o'clock to open up for the breakfast shift. And so many of these laws include either a prohibition against clopening, or if an employee decides to work, they're entitled to some kind of premium pay. One of the real important aspects of this that has caught a lot of attention is an element or a factor that requires that the employer offer shifts to existing part-time employees before they hire additional part-time employees. It's obviously intended to give people more hours, et cetera. And then finally, against the backdrop of all of this, all of these statutes and ordinances require or prohibit retaliation against an employee who might either assert his or her rights under these rules or bring a claim against an employer who might violate them. So those are some of the elements or factors that that these statutes and ordinances include.
Okay, yep, a lot to think about. Nathan, maybe you can jump in and talk about this. So considering all these changes that Bruce has outlined, what can a company do to prepare?
Well, there's probably a long list of things, but and maybe Molly will appreciate this because I also am a little bit of a data geek and I spend all of my time analyzing labor and employment data for a living, so I'd start with that. I think the best way is to start collecting all of the information that you would need in order to equip yourself to respond to these new laws, and that'll do at least a couple of things. One, and perhaps most importantly, that's going to allow an employer to stay on top of what's happening. You want to have a comprehensive and an accurate source of information as opposed to something that relies on anecdotes or what you hear back from the stores. That's going to allow the company to stay on top of a proactive assessment, and I think really it's going to help with item number 2, which is, anytime these new laws get rolled out or any real changes, you see that whether it's managers or the employees themselves, they don't really know how to react or they don't know what's required of them. And so I think it's pretty important to make sure that all of those employees, the managers as well, are educated and trained as to what the new expectations are. And as Bruce pointed out, those expectations are going to vary probably between different locales and states. And you want to be in a position to make sure that the employees and managers know exactly what's expected of them. In my experience, it's always really helpful to not just tell people what to do, but to show them what was done. So if you've got some data that you're tracking on this, you can point out what happened last week or last month, and how exceptional behavior, exceptional in the sense of exception to the law as opposed to exceptionally good, might have happened, and take corrective action and make sure that everybody knows what's expected of them. The last thing I would just say is that, and I think Bruce might remember this too, about 15 years ago, people were not paying very much attention to a wide variety of new laws or laws that were more relevant all of a sudden relating to wage and hour violations. And I'm thinking in particular about meal and rest break rules and the kinds of laws that relating to the data keeping and data reporting requirements that didn't seem probably very important to managers and I think to many employees, but having spent about a decade and a half analyzing data relating to those things, I can tell you I expect this one will be a target of interest for lots of folks too. So better to get a handle on the data early, better to be proactive in assessing your data yourself and make sure that you're correcting any problems that might be emerging now as opposed to waiting for somebody else to find them in potentially an environment that's not good for your company.
All right, great advice. So, Bruce, maybe you can address then this next question. What kinds of record keeping, posting, and data challenges arise from these types of laws and ordinances?
Yeah, that question is a great segue from what Nathan just said, because the record-keeping requirements under these various laws and ordinances can be quite onerous. Some of them are straightforward, but yet still onerous. For example, posting in the workplace notice of employee rights. We're all used to doing that, but at some point we're all going to have to get bigger walls because the number of postings that we have to put up these days are incredibly a large number of them, I should say, the employers are going to have to make good faith estimates of work schedules, which is going to generate more paperwork and more disclosure to their employers. We're going to have to generate standby lists of notice to employees about changes to their schedules and whether they consent to those changes. We're going to have to put up notices of available hours in those jurisdictions that require us to give shift preference to existing employees before we go out and we hire new employees. We're going to have to document an employee's consent to work a short shift, what we might call a short shift. In other words, to close late in the evening and open the next morning. Those aren't necessarily prohibited activities, but we have to get consent, and it has to be in writing, and then we have to pay premium for that. So it'll vary by jurisdiction, but it is going to increase the paper flow or the information exchange between employers and employees. There's no question about that. And I think one of the big challenges is whether an employer's payroll system is going to be able to keep up and account for all of those different pay scenarios and differences in the way that employees are paid, not just among one another, but the same employee is going to perhaps get a shift premium on one day or get waiting time compensation another day. So we're going to have to make sure that our payroll systems are up to the task. And as Nathan points out, we're now just kind of getting used to the whole ability to use technology to be more rigorous in our wage and hour compliance. This is going to add another layer of complexity, I think, to employers' abilities to do that with technology.
All right. Terrific. Thank you. And Nathan, I don't know if you'd like to add, are there any other data-related implications of these policies that you can think of?
Yeah, a couple. And let me first just echo exactly what Bruce just said, which is there are, no matter how simple it might sound, in explaining it, and maybe folks out there in the audience will know what I'm talking about, but it is amazing how many pitfalls there are in timekeeping and payroll when companies haven't quite figured out how to address all of these different laws and roll them in with whatever laws already exist in order to make sure that people are getting paid appropriately according to the law for all their hours worked. So all by itself, that's going to be a big challenge. And I think one thing, and this maybe echoes back to something that Molly raised, which is, it's not all bad news in terms of if you are on top of your data. In some of these fairness ideas about the fairness in scheduling and kind of keeping track of how you're treating employees proactively, this gives, I think, another tool to management to make sure that they are keeping their employees as happy as possible and are keeping them as satisfied as they can. And it's I spend a lot of time doing work with companies that are interested in their diversity and whether or not they're meeting their goals for promotion and retention and that sort of thing. And I think this is another topic where you could say, I could take a look at it through that lens and make sure that I'm treating all of my employees, regardless of their race and ethnic or gender background, in an equal way. So I view that as maybe a positive way to use the data in light of these new laws.
Okay, excellent. So moving on from the data discussion, Bruce, maybe you can address this next question. What are the potential monetary penalties to which employers are now exposed to under these laws and ordinances?
Well, again, it'll depend on the jurisdiction, but there certainly are some significant penalties under many, if not all, of these either enacted laws and ordinances or ones that have been proposed. For example, in the city of Seattle, there is a private right of action under its ordinance, and you can incur as much as a $500 penalty for failure to provide, for example, a good faith estimate of what the employee's schedule is going to be. New York City is very similar. There's a private right of action of $500 for each violation, and if you violate some of the advance notice ordinance is it's a $200 penalty. So and I haven't found one yet that doesn't also include a right to recover attorney's fees for violations of these local ordinances and statutes, and which to be quite frank and trying to be fair only makes sense because an attorney is not going to have an incentive to help an employee enforce his or her rights with such a small penalty unless they can recover their fees, and that's the whole purpose of a fee shifting statute. But one of the things that Nathan alluded to, which I completely agree with, is that these laws and ordinances are kind of ripe for class action litigation at some point. They're kind of too new at this point, I think, to draw much litigation attention. But I'm sure that it will. If an employer makes a last-minute change to a schedule, it pays money. If an employer requires an employee to be on call to work a particular shift, it pays money. If an employer cancels a shift at the last minute, it pays money. And you can go on and on. The list is quite long. In isolation, none of those claims are particularly valuable, but if you combine several hundred or several thousand employees for an employer who allegedly is out of compliance with these regulations, that number adds up really fast. And any of the folks in the audience who have dealt with, for example, meal and rest period class action litigation, you know what I'm talking about. A relatively small reward for an individual plaintiff, when it's combined with 10,000 of his closest friends, can generate a big number, and big fees paying people like Nathan and me to analyze your data and defend you. So this is going to happen. It's just a question of when, I think.
All right. Nathan, as a follow-up, so assuming class action pattern and practice allegation is made, what are the implications from the standpoint of the expert who may be analyzing and testifying in these cases?
Yeah, well, it's critical to have data. I mean, that's really the key thing. I mentioned earlier that it's good to have data to be proactive and to make sure that you roll it out and get your training done and all of that. But in the event that it's after the fact and there is a litigation, having data means having the possibility of defending yourself. And seeing what the data actually show. And certainly we have some clients who have data that doesn't show exactly what they wanted it to show, but at least they know it's an accurate source of information that can be relied upon, whether it's in a litigation or settling a litigation. But certainly without the data, there's a kind of a presumption that the allegations from somebody else who's describing maybe anecdotes from their own personal experience or the experience that they've heard from others that they work with can be more persuasive because there's nothing to rebut that anecdotal evidence with. And so certainly with data, even if there are some blemishes in the data, I would say that a company is always better off in defending itself by having that accurate and comprehensive information to rely upon. And again, that's the case whether they are trying to defend themselves and say they didn't do something wrong, or they didn't do something wrong on a class-wide basis, or even if they have acknowledged that they might have done something wrong and they want to work towards a settlement that is as fair and accurate as it possibly can be.
All right, thank you. Yeah, retailers definitely need to take away from this discussion that the data is going to be really important. I think you made that point well. So to wrap up the discussion, I'll ask both of you to just give us an idea of what's next.
Well, this is Bruce. I guess I'll start. I see this as part of, I think what only can be described as an accelerating trend by state and local governments to move beyond the protections that traditionally have been afforded by federal law. And it wasn't too long ago that almost all of the action was at the federal level, whether it's the federal wage and hour statute or whether it's federal leave law, et cetera. But obviously California's been at the front of this, but now we see it in other jurisdictions as well, where the states are really stepping up to regulate the employment relationship. We see it with paid leave laws that go well beyond the Family and Medical Leave Act at the federal level. We're seeing it now with what we've been talking about today with predictive scheduling. We see other attempts to regulate the employer-employee relationship, like New York City's new proposal to ban employers from requiring employees to answer phones or respond to emails after hours that are called right to disconnect bills. We see it obviously with the minimum wage all over the country, where cities and localities are in some states are raising the minimum wage above the federal thresholds. So I don't see anytime soon that this movement in the states to manage the employment relationship are going to end anytime soon. I think it's just going to accelerate.
Yeah, this is Nathan. Yeah, sure. I think we're underway, right? So Bruce said it correctly. It's accelerating. It's out there, and it's going to grow. So you may as well start gathering your information, collecting your data now, prepare, and get all your employees trained up and ready for it. And I think if you do that, if you're proactive about it, there are plenty of ways that this can be a positive. Tying it back to what Molly was saying, in terms of the fairness and the predictability about scheduling and knowing when your plan is going to be and knowing that you can count on it. I think companies ought to be thinking about ways to play all of that to the positive, as opposed to worrying about this as yet another kind of record-keeping difficulty. But you've got to actually do it. You've got to be proactive about it and collect the data and know what's coming.
Mm-hmm.
All right, excellent. So thank you so much to Bruce and Nathan for giving us a very effective and thorough explanation. With that, I'm going to turn the conversation back over to Molly to wrap up, and then to audience Q&A.
Great. Yeah, it was such a fascinating discussion. So many elements to this, and I couldn't agree more with the last point that was made, that really being in compliance is necessary but not sufficient to have a great organization, right? And so I think a lot of organizations can treat this as sort of a draconian process. It's something that's arduous that they have to do, or they can find a way to do it and gather their data and use that data to not only be compliant, but also sort of raise their employee experience and sort of raise the performance of their business. So I think it's a big challenge that retailers are facing, but obviously there's tools and technology that are out there to help, and also resources like the experts we've had on today to help them think through how do you make this the compliance, the necessary work gets done, but making sure you're also living those compliance rules as well. Because I think the other two, Bruce and Nathan, would back me up when someone gets sued for noncompliance, they don't just look at what's written in your policy book. They want to look at what actually happened, and you need the data to do that. So. And really what it comes down to is helping people simplify to understand what the laws mean to them, personalizing it. We talked about the data collection in terms of integration with payroll, and that is so personal, and sort of what is consensual for someone. Someone may be happy to do co-openings because they like the pay differential, and some people it may not work for them. So being able to sort of customize and personalize. And then communicating. One of my favorite quotes is the Shaw quote about the biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has happened. So making sure that everyone understands what's expected of them as well. And I'll just leave you again with this last point that we've taught quite a bit. But technology is fantastic. Technology can help us keep those records, keep them at hand. If there is ever a question, not only do you have the data, but you can access it quickly. It can help you manage some of these rules, but it's also the mindset of the organization. If you're set to optimize for labor costs, what's that costing you in terms of goodwill from your employees or experience for your customers? So really thinking through the strategy and communicating not just the tools and how to use them, but really what's the sort of spirit of the culture of the organization that you want to imbue as well as just the technology tools. So with that, I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Obviously, I know we've got everyone's contact information at the end. I'm happy to answer any questions about our research, but also I know we've got some Q&A right here now with all three of us.
All right, terrific. Thanks again, Molly, Nathan, and Bruce. It was a fascinating discussion, absolutely. And we do have a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. I just want to remind the audience, please feel free to send your questions in. If we don't get to your question, the presenters will be able to follow up with you afterwards. So feel free to send in your questions. I'm sure they've given you a lot to think about. So I'm going to jump in with the first question and let whoever would like to respond, please feel free to respond. So the first question we've gotten in is, how do we find the right partners to help educate key stakeholders in the company about the importance of these initiatives, as well as helping employees with education and training?
I can comment on that a little bit. I mean, some of it is really understanding what your pain points are, right? Is it education more for your managers or for your employees? So making sure you understand what problems you're trying to solve, and then looking for providers that don't just provide technology and partners that don't just provide technology or tools, but really provide that expertise on an ongoing basis. Keeping up with these laws, keeping up with how they impact your payroll and your timekeeping and your scheduling is really a huge job. So I think part of it is looking for partners that have sort of that holistic view of their partnership with you, which is not just selling you technology, but also sort of being your partner through navigating this sort of increasingly litigious environment that we seem to be in when it comes to labor law.
Mm-hmm. All right, anybody else want to jump in on that one? Mm-hmm.
Just real briefly, this is Bruce. I agree with Molly. I think this is a simple answer, but I think it's the truth. I think you really have to think about targeted training for every level of your enterprise or organization to make sure they understand not just the compliance issues behind this, but there's actually some really good social science out there talking about why some of these things actually make sense for improving the quality of your workforce and also the quality of your customer experience. And so I think that's one way you get their stakeholders to buy in, is you make it clear to them that they have something to gain from this. It's not just yet another compliance issue. It's not yet another training by some lawyer who comes in and tells me what I can and can't do. I mean, there are some real reasons to do this.
Yeah, there's almost a social justice piece of it too, right? To say that we're helping people make decisions about their work life.
All right, thank you very much. So we have another question, and this question is, are smaller companies equally impacted by the new laws as larger companies?
This is Bruce. I can start. I think clearly the answer to that question is the bigger companies, the larger companies, the multi-jurisdictional companies are the ones who have to worry about this the most at the present time. But it's often the case that a law that starts out applying to a large company very well may end up kind of eventually apply to small companies as well. But there is a recognition by rulemakers and legislators that smaller companies don't have the ability to absorb some of these costs. I mean, for example, it's the reason why the Family Medical Leave Act only applies to employers with 50 or more employees, because it's a legislative compromise that smaller employers can't afford some of these protections. But here's one more, maybe a question for a social scientist and a lawyer. As these laws become more prevalent and workers start working for companies that have these protections and limitations, it may spill over to the smaller companies, and workers might be demanding those kinds of benefits from smaller companies, and so smaller companies may have to provide some of this protection just to compete with the big branch down the road or the big restaurant chain down the road. So that's one way it could impact smaller companies.
Yeah, this is Nathan. I think that's right, and I think it at least could be tougher for smaller companies to react as well as the larger companies can. I think one other thing, just to tie it back to the wage and hour kind of area, we saw plenty of companies that were growing and expanding and moving into new states or opening up a new outlet in a new city that didn't realize that when they moved into the new state they had to follow different rules than maybe the state they had come from. And I think that's probably going to be the case here too, that there's going to be a little bit of surprise for companies that are not kind of educated. There maybe isn't a law in their particular jurisdiction, but they're moving into one where those laws do apply. And I think there's got to be a role there as well for somebody to come in and help them know what's happening as they move into the new location.
All right, a lot of great points. So I think that we're just about out of time for today, but I want to remind our audience that if you do have questions that we did not get to, please feel free to send them in, and our speakers will reach out to you afterwards. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to thank all of our speakers. It's been a fascinating conversation, given our viewers, our attendees, a lot to think about. We appreciate your time, and you can view this presentation on demand as well, so I'm sure that you'll want to go back and listen to some of the key points. So once again, thanks everyone for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.